When we encounter Jesus at the start of John chapter 6, we find Jesus in the midst of a crowd, a hungry crowd. Now, we've been walking through the Gospel of John for the last 3 weeks in our Unity sermon series. Last week, we were incredibly blessed to have Dr. Mark Laberton here, where he shared about Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well, where he offers her living water and an invitation back into restored community. We know from this series that the Gospel of John is very different from the other 3 Gospels, written in the latest period where the church was facing persecution. The Gospel of John frames Jesus as creator. He starts the Gospel, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the rare miracles that's recorded in all 4 Gospels, so this should make us pay attention. Each gospel writer highlights different aspects of the story, with John using the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 as a sign that Jesus is the Son of God. The story in John immediately follows the questions about the authority of Jesus and the testimony of Scripture. When Jesus has completed the miracle, the crowd recognizes the multiplication of the loaves and fish as a sign. In verse 14, they say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." When we meet the crowd in this story, the crowd is following Jesus across the Sea of Galilee. The crowd, we read, is following Jesus because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. This is a crowd in need. They were weary from travel on their way to Jerusalem for Passover. They were sick and hungry and poor in resources. When Jesus sees the crowd, he asks Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" The scripture tells us that he asked this to test Philip, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip looks at the problem and responds factually. It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. The problem at hand is one that is bigger than can be solved. And don't we know how this feels? What is it that comes to your mind when you think about problems that feel too big for a solution right now? These days, when I watch the news and see all the problems that we're facing, political, economic, environmental, wars, violence, racism, xenophobia, you name it, it feels impossible to find a solution. I feel like Philip, facing a problem bigger than he can fix, and going to Jesus and stating, the problem is just too big. But the story tells us another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will this go among so many?" Andrew also has some doubts, but he brings forward a boy who has offered his 5 loaves and 2 fish. I love that John tells us that these are small loaves and 2 fish, as if that would make any difference, right, for a crowd of 5,000 people. Jesus tells the crowd to sit in the grass. Jesus takes the loaves, breaks them, gives thanks, and he distributes to them, it's written, as much as they wanted. Verse 12 says, when they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. When Jesus multiplies the bread and fish, there isn't just enough, but an abundance. The crowd isn't eating to survive, but can eat to fullness. God's kingdom is a kingdom of abundance. There's a few key takeaways from this story that I don't want us to miss. When Jesus sees the hungry crowd, his first thought is compassion towards them. In the Gospel of Mark, it says, Jesus, had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. This miracle flows out of the compassion of Jesus. Jesus could have done this miracle alone. He could have fed them out of thin air, like God provided manna in the wilderness for the Israelites when they had fled Egypt and were going on to the promised land. But Jesus invites his disciples to be a part of the miracle. In Mark's version of the story, Jesus tells his disciples, "You give them something to eat." Jesus immediately calls them to serve. He calls them into ministry. Even the little boy who offers his lunch gets to serve. Any of us can be used by God when we offer ourselves, when we offer our resources. God can take our small loaves and small fish and multiply them. You know, this is actually the story that always comes to my mind when it's time to give the offering during the service. It's amazing to me that we get to participate in God's work of healing and restoration through our gifts, our time, our talents, our financial resources. These small gifts that we give get multiplied by Jesus into abundance. And it doesn't just bless us, but blesses all those around us. The little boy gives away his lunch in faith, but then he and the whole crowd get to eat until they're full. Sometimes I wonder how often we are waiting for God to do something when he's inviting us to take the first step to offer our resources in faith. If we read further along in the passage, we find that the crowd continues to follow Jesus back across the lake. The crowd wants more bread, but Jesus points deeper. He challenges them. Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Jesus goes on to tell them that it is the Father who gives true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The people respond, "Sir, always give us this bread." Then Jesus declares, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." And here Jesus is saying something astonishing. He is calling himself the bread of life. Here he makes an I am statement. Throughout John, Jesus uses the ego eimi, the Greek word for I am, to state these truths about himself. I am the living water. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life. These statements don't necessarily mean that much to us when we hear it in English and in our culture, but to his original hearers, saying I am would connect them to the very name of God. In the famous scene in Exodus 3, God reveals his name to Moses as I am who I am. So this is a bold and dangerous thing for Jesus to say, and would be understood by his hearers as claims to divinity. So now, positioning himself as God with all power and authority that comes alongside his position, he claims himself as the bread of life. Jesus alone is the only source that will satisfy our deepest hunger. Whoever comes to Jesus will never hunger and never thirst. Jesus alone, the bread of life alone, is our source of unity as the church. When we come to Jesus and eat of the bread and drink of the wine, when we are in communion with Jesus, we become mysteriously one body.